You know, there's something that I've never really talked about here on After Prison Show, and that is my battle with addiction. Now, just to go ahead and say this from the start, I no longer have a problem with drugs. But there is this saying that goes, once an addict, always an addict. And I have to be honest with you, I believe that to be one of the truest things that I've ever heard in my life. And I'm going to tell you why in just a bit. But what I want to start first with in this video is telling you just what it was like for me when I was younger and I first became introduced to cocaine. I will never forget a friend of mine asking me, "Hey, you want to do some blow?" And me being young and curious, I wanted to know what it was all about. Unfortunately for me, that was probably one of the biggest mistakes I ever made in my life. Because from that first introduction to that drug, I became an out of control monster. And I try to think of why this drug was basically able to just grab me by the balls and put its hooks in me. And of course, a big reason for that was because of the way that it made me feel. I loved the uppity feeling like I was never gonna go to sleep. I can remember times when I didn't sleep for days because of this drug. But the high that came from this drug was only part of the problem I had when it came to my addiction to cocaine. And this is gonna sound absolutely crazy, but another reason I became so addicted to this drug stems back to that story that I just told recently here on After Prison Show, where I basically told my entire life story and how I told you in that story about when I was 13 years old and I gave away all of my mother's jewelry at school to some girls in an effort to make them like me. Well, my addiction problem was pretty similar to that whole situation that happened when I was 13 years old. And the reason there is this similarity is because of the fact that when I had this drug, people liked me, especially girls. And for some crazy reason, I always had this problem with trying to make girls like me. I don't know what the hell is wrong with me, but that has always been this problem in my life. Maybe not so much now, but when I was younger, this definitely was a big issue for me. And when you begin to do drugs and you begin to dabble in that lifestyle, well, that lifestyle tends to bring other people who are wrapped up in it as well. And when I was 18 years old and first introduced to this drug that would literally grip me by the balls, I met quite a few girls who like to do this drug as well. And for some strange reason, the way that I used to think at that time was, if I had these drugs, then girls would like me. Sort of similar to when I was 13 years old and at school with my mother's jewelry. If I had my mother's jewelry at school to give away to these girls, then they also would like me. I'm telling you, I really had a twisted way of thinking about things when I was younger. From the age of 18 to 26, I battled this addiction with cocaine. And there were times in my life that I could remember specifically where I felt like I never would be able to let go of this drug. I never would be able to walk away from it. I literally felt like I would suffer from this addiction for the rest of my life. Like there was nothing I could do about it. That is how bad this drug literally affected not only my entire life, but also my way of thinking. And it was because of the fact that I was doing this drug so much, feeling like I was never gonna be able to let go of this, that nothing good came of my life for like a decade. All this drug brought into my life was the wrong people and the wrong situations to be in, which ultimately led to me spending much of my adult life, most of my adult life to be more specific, in and out of jail and prison. And what I'm about to tell you next is something that's like not easy at all for me to say. But not only did I battle with this addiction to cocaine, sniffing cocaine, there were also times in my life when Joe was a crackhead. From that first introduction to that drug cocaine, soon followed another introduction to a cooked up version of this drug, crack cocaine. And when I think back to the times in my life when I actually used to smoke crack, these times are without a doubt when I was at my absolute fucking lowest in life, not caring about anything in my own personal life or anything that happens to me in it. The only times that I would ever really sober up during all of this time that I spent suffering from this addiction is when I actually would get locked up. But the crazy thing about that is I can remember vividly being locked up after being out there in the free world suffering from this addiction and having dreams while I was locked up about going home and doing these drugs again. And as I think back on all of this, it's just crazy to me to think how strong the hold these drugs actually had on me was. To be locked up and to be dreaming about going home and doing drugs, that's like fucking insanity. So it's not hard to imagine that after I would come home from being locked up, it would not take long at all before I would be right back in that same exact addicted lifestyle, hanging out with those same people who were doing nothing other than bringing me completely fucking down. I think by the time I was like 21 years old, I came to the conclusion that there was no way in hell I could ever smoke crack again. And as good of a revelation as this sounds to be reached in my life, it really wasn't that great of a thing at all. Because the way I justified me never smoking crack again was by saying, well, as long as I'm not smoking crack, that's okay. Instead, I'll just sniff cocaine. And that kind of brings up that whole substituting one thing for another, one drug for another. This was not a good substitution at all. Because at 21 years old, I went completely off the deep end into my addiction with cocaine. I was doing so much cocaine at this point in my life. There was no way in hell I was going to be able to do anything good with my life at all. In fact, I can remember I had this job, this construction job, one of the best jobs I ever had in my life, where I had like so much room to literally climb the corporate ladder at this job. This company loved me. I was lead man on my crew. My boss loved me. The owners of the company loved me. But my foreman at this job, he wasn't an idiot. In fact, he knew he could just look at me and tell that I had some sort of a drug problem. And this one day he came to me and he said, Joe, hey, look, we're getting ready to start this new job. Part of the orientation is you have to take a drug test. And what he said to me next should have been like some sort of eye-opening experience for me. But he said, Joe, if you need me to put you with another crew for like a week, I'll understand. I looked my boss square in the face and I said, I'm okay. I can pass a drug test. Well, when I went and took that drug test, I pissed in the cup and the woman asked me, she said, how many lines do you see on this test right here? I see 4. She said, yeah. Well, you're supposed to see 5. You're dirty for cocaine. And because I failed that drug test right there, I immediately was fired from this job. The owners of the company couldn't even believe it. They literally called me into the office. They said, Joe, we had all of these high hopes for you. We were ready to make you your own crew leader. We were going to give you a company truck. But now we can't do any of that because you just failed this drug test. And this has to be documented and sent to corporate. So we have to fire you. And that right there is just one example of many different times that I was completely pissing my life down the toilet because of this addiction to cocaine. So you've probably been wondering for a while now, like, how the hell was I able to overcome this addiction? And the simplest way to put that is, I finally reached a point in my life where I had had enough. In fact, it was after I came home from prison the first time that I said, there's no fucking way in hell I can get wrapped up back in these drugs again. But I'm not going to lie to you. There were times after I came home from prison that very first time that I did do cocaine. I would be trying not to do cocaine, meet people who were doing cocaine or who had this drug, and that was why I kept having these relapses. But even with those relapses, after the fact, I would continue to tell myself, Joe, you cannot do these drugs anymore. If you have any hope for yourself whatsoever that you can do anything with your life at this point, you have got to stop doing these drugs. And at some point, with me continuing to tell myself, I cannot fucking do this, I can't do it, I have to stop, don't do it, Joe, it finally started to catch hold. And even though I did stop doing the drugs, well, that didn't mean that the drugs were completely out of my life, because at that point, I began to try to sell them. The stupidest fucking logic in the world. Here is a person who is trying to overcome a drug addiction, and they're finally starting to overcome that drug addiction. And what is the first thing they decide to do when that starts to happen for them? I decide I'm going to start trying to sell drugs. And that is what ultimately led to me getting locked up this very last time, where I just served these 7 years. But it was during these 7 years where I had almost a decade to sober up. I'm not going to say I didn't have opportunities to do drugs while I was locked up, because when you are in prison, in a lot of cases, there's just as much drugs in prison as there are out there in the free world. So there were plenty of times where I could have continued to do drugs if I so chose to, but I chose not to, because I had finally reached a point in my life where I had completely had enough. And I said that this was going to end now. It has to. I know I have the capability to do something in this world. I don't know exactly what it is at this point in my life, but I know I have the capability to do something. And if that is going to happen, then drugs can't be a part of the picture at all. And the only way that I feel that anyone in this world can overcome an addiction that they may suffer from is if they reach that same type of conclusion for themselves. Nobody in this world, no sort of program, no sort of anything can make you stop doing drugs unless you say for yourself you're not going to do those drugs anymore. Throughout the 7 years that I served in prison this last time, and throughout the entire course of my adult life, I lost so many close friends to drug overdoses. You would have thought throughout my 20s that would have been eye-opening enough for me to get the point, but it wasn't. The only thing that actually made me decide it's time to stop doing these drugs is when I actually decided that for myself. And I will be completely honest with you as well, that is not an easy thing to do. Just because you decide you're not going to do these drugs doesn't mean it's just going to happen. Because you're going to deal with these freaking urges that say, hey Joe, hey, let's go get some blow. Let's go get some blow and some girls. Let's go have a party. And when those urges come, you have to be strong enough to literally knock those thoughts right out of your mind. Shake them the fuck off. Do whatever you have to overcome those urges at that moment, because they are going to come. Sometimes they may come frequently. Sometimes they may come at your absolute weakest and lowest points. Maybe you're depressed. Maybe you're feeling sad. Maybe you're looking for any type of an excuse to justify going and doing these drugs just one more time. But I can promise you that if you do give in to those urges saying, hey, look, it'll just be one more time, I can promise you this, it will not be just one more time. All of this brings back what I mentioned at the very beginning of this video. Once an addict, always an addict. And the reason that is true is because no matter how sober you become, no matter how long you go without doing these drugs, however much time is in between the last time that you did these drugs, there will always come times in your life at some point after you have quit doing these drugs where those thoughts will return. Over time, they won't come as often, but they will still come to you at some point in your life. And when they do, you will have to be just as strong as you were in the beginning of you actually trying to quit these drugs to ensure that you don't go back out there and do these drugs again. For me personally, I haven't done drugs in almost a decade. A big part of that time I did spend locked up, but again, there are just as many drugs in prison as there are in the free world. So just because I was locked up doesn't mean it was easy for me to not do these drugs as well. But even at almost a decade since I last touched drugs, I still get urges. I still get fucking urges to go do drugs. In fact, I just recently had an urge. Maybe like last week, I had this little thought that came into my mind. Joe, hey, you there, Joe? Do you want to go do anything? And no sooner did that thought come into my mind, I absolutely had to shove that shit right the fuck out of it. Because I will be damned at this point in my life if I'm going to let anything fuck up what I've been trying to do for myself and for others, especially if it pertains to getting high. The only thing that I ever saw come from addiction was bad shit. People overdosing and dying. I cannot possibly begin to tell you how many friends I've lost to some sort of a drug addiction and overdose. A completely clouded judgment that will oftentimes lead you to doing the dumbest shit ever and putting your ass right in prison. And sometimes what you may do while on these drugs may be something that causes you to never be allowed to see the free world again. If you suffer from any sort of an addiction problem, then I hope this video reaches you. And I hope that it lets you know that what you deal with right now is something that can be overcome. But the only way that it will be overcome is if you decide that enough is enough. You are the only one who can change what is wrong in your life right now. The only one who has the capability to make it any better. Again, nobody can do it for you. If you're not willing to do it for yourself, then it will never happen. But all it takes is for you to say today, I'm fucking done. And from there, it will take you doing everything humanly possible to back up that statement alone. I'm done. I did it. I didn't think that I could, but I did. And you can do the same damn thing. And one thing that I can tell you that I've realized personally since being sober and being without drugs in my life is that life sure is a lot better without those drugs in my life. Hey, look. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did so, please leave a like and a comment letting me know exactly what you thought about it. And as always, until next time, enjoy life, the free world. Never take a moment for granted, and make the most of every day. Peace!